Welcome, everybody, to the NFL Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. The NFL Show, as always, is brought to you by Replenishing Care and Technologies. Make sure you check out rcandt.com. I am your co-host for the NFL Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, NFL beat writer, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right. Now we're going to go to the decade of the 90s and the top 10 players. Were you alive in the 90s, Sam?
For 1 year. Or for like 6 months.
Year. Oh, for 6 months. All right. So since you have so much knowledge of that, I'm just kidding, because you obviously do from the list that we've done in the past. Who's your number 10 guy in the 1990s?
I got a little split in my number 10 because I wanted to make sure I included two players. So I actually have a tie at number 10, even though I usually don't like ties. I've got Reggie White and John Randall tied for 10. John Randall, 6-time first-team All-Pro, 106 sacks during the decade. Meanwhile, Reggie White was the 1998 Defensive Player of the Year. Obviously, he won a Super Bowl with the Green Bay Packers. And he was a 4-time first-team All-Pro with 111.5 sacks during the decade. I feel like John Randall deserves the spot. I know Reggie White, just partially because the name itself deserves his place in this list, but I couldn't overlook what John Randall did, and I feel like he doesn't get enough love whenever we talk about some of the best defensive tackles of all time.
All right, my number 10 is Brett Favre. I didn't really want to put him on the list, but I figure I almost had to. Pro Bowl 92, 93, 95, 96, 97. He was a hell of a quarterback. He was an NFL MVP, the AP NFL MVP, 95, 96, 97. 5-time NFC Player of the Year. My problem is, as it's always been, when you look at the 10 most memorable plays from the playoffs in his career, the majority of them were failures, Sam.
He had Stroll in the playoffs, obviously that won that one Super Bowl, but we've talked about this in the past in terms of comparing him to other all-time great quarterbacks. He kind of falls short. We're talking about clutch time performances and going out and winning in key situations.
Did he make your top 10?
He did make my top 10. He's up in a couple of spots.
He shouldn't be. But all right, my number 9 is Rod Woodson, who was an 11-time Pro Bowl selection, including 1990, 91, 92, 93, 94, 96, and 99. I think he was a 1993 NFL Defensive Player of the Year, over 1,100 tackles, 13.5 sacks, 71 interceptions. And, you know, when you look at it, to me, Rod Woodson, I think, was the second best corner of that decade behind Dion Sanders, who I have a little bit higher. But Rod Woodson, to me, was also a guy that transitioned, played safety later in his career. It was very good at that also. And 17 total touchdowns for a defensive player is crazy.
Yeah, well, I think Dion Sanders was possibly one of the best shutdown corners, if not the best shutdown corner of all time. I think Rod Woodson had a little bit more.
But go ahead.
I think Rod Woodson had a little bit more of a dynamic style of play, in my opinion. Maybe I'm a little bit biased as a Steelers fan, but I think he had a little bit more in terms of what he brought to just the return game and a little bit more to his own style than maybe what Dion had.
I don't know. I mean, when you look at the 17 touchdowns, only 13 of them were defensive. Rod Woodson also had 4 touchdowns as a return man.
Yeah, it's close. I think public opinion will always side with Dion Sanders' way. I would too, but I think Rod Woodson gets gets overlooked mainly because he played at the same time as Dion Sanders.
Well, how about this? Who tackled better?
I think Dion Sanders isn't known as.
That's not even close. Dion Sanders couldn't tackle.
It's Rod Woodson, right?
Put it like this: you never could have put Dion Sanders at safety.
Yeah, because Rod Woodson had a little more of a dynamic style to him because he can play that way. He make that transition. I don't think Dion Sanders ever could have, because Rod Woodson, in my opinion, was a more complete player. Dion was better at the specialty of shutting that guys down, but Rod Woodson had a little bit more of a dynamic style play to him. He could do more for you defensively than Dion could.
Well, I'll talk about Dion in a minute. The other reason I had Dion a little bit higher is Dion was a game changer, special teams wise. He was a player, and I think he had more of an impact on a game than Woodson did, even though I think Woodson was a more complete player, and I know that may not make any sense, but go ahead. Who do you got at number 9, Sam?
Number 9, I'm going to switch around a little bit, actually. I'm going to put Brett Favre at number 9. I originally had him a little bit higher, but we've talked about some of the shortcomings he's had. He did win 3 MVPs in a row there, but he kind of fell off a little bit towards the late 90s. He had a couple down years. and gets to the point where he started being that kind of gunslinger guy, taking all those risks, making a lot of mistakes at the same time. So when you take the good for Brett Favre, you also take the bad, and there's a lot of bad there as well in terms of what happened when he hurt his own team a couple of times because of foolish mistakes.
All right, my number 8 is Dion Sanders. I mean, electrifying was probably the best name for him, and it seemed like whenever he switched from the Cowboys to the 49ers, whoever he switched to won the Super Bowl. 2-time Super Bowl champion, AP NFL Defensive Player of the Year in 1994, 2-time NFC Defensive Player of the Year in 93 and 94. Plus, he wasn't a bad baseball player.
He did all right. But can I ask you, who is the best cornerback of all time in your opinion?
Mel Blunt.
Hey, I like that answer. I like that answer, Mike. I can go with that one.
I like Mel Blunt. I mean, they got the Mel Blunt rule. Mel Blunt was shut down because, I mean, the one thing you have to give Dion is this. He played when it was tougher than what it was for Blunt, because Blunt, you could put your hands on a receiver until the ball was in the air. And you couldn't do that when Dion played. But all around, making an impact, I'll take Mel Blunt.
Yeah, because he could do a lot more. He's a tough guy. I like that physicality that defense backs have. And when you can play that way, I think it makes a bigger difference than when you're just a shutdown corner.
All right, who do you have at number 7, Sam?
Actually, I think we're still at my number 8. My number 8 is John Elway. And I recognize that maybe seems a little crazy, seems a little bit too low. If we're talking about his entire career, I think you can make the argument he's a top 5 quarterback of all time. My issue is he played a lot during the 80s and the 90s, so he's kind of split between 2 decades. He doesn't really have that full encapsulating decade where he just had everything go right for him. He did win those 2 Super Bowls kind of late in his career when he's turning downward a little bit. And he did make 6 Pro Bowls. He had an 84-49 record during the decade. I think he belongs in the top 10. I just don't think he belongs in like the top 5 category for the 1990s.
Well, I disagree, Sam, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But all right, who do you got at number 7?
Yeah, my number 7 is Dion Sanders for all the reasons you just mentioned. The Defensive Player of the Year, 2 Super Bowls, 6-time first-team All-Pro. But one thing I think that does hold him back is that he wasn't the full package. He didn't have that tackling, as you mentioned. I think that really is what holds him back in some conversations, which is why he's not known as the best defensive back of all time in every circle. It's because he doesn't have that tackling aspect to his game.
All right, my number, where am I at? 6 or 7, Sam, since you keep track of the numbers?
I think you're probably at 7 by now.
All right, I'm going to go Junior Seau. I think Junior Seau was the best linebacker of this decade. If you look, he was a Pro Bowler every year. But on top of that, we talked about the difference between Pro Bowls and being an All-Pro selection. All-Pro selection in the decade, the only 2 years he was not All-Pro was 1990 and 1995. He was the UPI AFC Defensive Player of the Year in 92. NFL All-Decade Team, 2 Super Bowl appearances, 1,800 tackles, 56 sacks. I think, hands down, he was the best pure linebacker during the 1990s. And I think with the way his life ended, I think it kind of overshadows how great of a player he was. And he wasn't a pass rusher like a Derek Thomas or a Kevin Green, but he could do everything.
Yeah, which is why I don't have him in my top 10, but I think I would probably take him on.
Crazy. He's the best linebacker of the decade.
And look at Mike, there's a lot of really good players from this decade. I think this decade might be even more stacked than the last one, especially at running back. But
I don't think so.
No? The
No,
80s were better?
I mean, I don't see how Junior Seau can't be in the top 10. All-decade team. He was, I mean, every year he was in the league except for 1 year, which he wasn't in the league. I mean, you're looking at a Pro Bowler, and you're looking at All-Pro every year except for 1995. And he was a huge reason why the San Diego Chargers actually got to Super Bowl 29.
Yeah, I'm not denying his impact, but everyone else on this list is also all-decade team, and they have all the all-pro selections and stuff like that.
But do you have another linebacker ahead of him?
I don't have another linebacker ahead of him.
All right. Then why are you arguing with me?
I was not – you're the one who came at me, I think, at this one.
Yeah, because I get bored when we agree all the time. All right, I'm going to go number 6. I'm going to go Emmitt Smith. I can actually see him higher than this, too. NFL record for career rushing yards, over 18,000. NFL record for career rushing touchdowns, 164. He was a 4-time All-Pro selection. The thing that stands out to me about Emmitt Smith is a lot of people don't give him the accolades he deserves because they say, well, he played on this greatest offensive line of all time. And I think they may have been. But the game that stands out to me would have been at the Meadowlands in 1993, last game of the season. The Cowboys have to beat the Giants to win the division. And he plays with a separated shoulder the entire game and carries the team to a victory that would lead to a Super Bowl. And the other thing is, I think it was that same year he holds out the first 2 games. They go 0-2. As soon as he comes back, they lose like 2 games the rest of the season. So to me, I think Emmitt Smith, and I think Emmitt Smith was the kind of guy that made people around him better.
But yeah, we talk about other great players from that team like Troy Aikman and Michael Irvin, but let's be honest, Emmitt Smith was the engine of that team that made everything work. It's the same way in Dallas now, honestly, with Zeke Elliott. I know he's not as good as Emmitt Smith, nowhere near the same level, but it's the running back that makes that offense go, and that's how it worked for Emmitt Smith. That's why I have him a little bit higher on my list than you do.
All right, who do you got next? Where are you at, number 5?
I'm at number 6 right now, and my number 6, and I actually debated putting this guy a little bit higher. My number 6 is Randall McDaniel. I think he was in a decade where you also had guys like Dermontti Dawson, Bruce Matthews, Tony Boselli, and Willie Roaf. I thought that Randall McDaniel was the best offensive lineman from the 90s. He was dominant during that decade, 7-time first-team All-Pro selections, all 10 Pro Bowls. I think you can't argue he's got to be a top 10 player from that decade.
I would argue. I think Bruce Matthews was better.
I don't know if he was – I thought McDaniel had a higher peak. I thought he would be the one that you would take for a top 10. I think he might have been the better one.
McDaniel was a guard, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Matthews was a tackle?
Matthews played basically everything during his career. He bounced around between guard and tackle.
There you go. All right, so now you know the difference, right? You want to change your number 5 or number 6 there?
Nope, I'm keeping McDaniel.
Okay, take the guard that can just play guard. What about Larry Allen?
I considered him as well because we already talked about that being a prominent part of Dallas's offensive line. But at the same point, we talked about doing him and Boselli in the past. We mentioned the 2 of them, and I would have taken Boselli almost where I would have taken Allen, in my opinion. So I left both of them off the list. So I wasn't going to take Larry Allen.
I think Larry Allen was the closest thing to Anthony Munoz we've seen.
Really? You think he was that good?
Not as good as Munoz, but I think he's the closest I've ever seen to it. Yeah, I think he's the second best tackle I ever saw.
Didn't he spend a lot of time at guard, though, like later in his career?
Later in his career, but we're talking about in his prime, which his prime was in the 90s. My number 5 is John Elway. I don't see how you could have him as low as what you had him because this is a guy, I mean, he was Pro Bowler 91, 93, 94, 96, 97, 98, won 2 Super Bowls. Of course, his NFL MVP award was in the 80s, but his Super Bowl 33 MVP was what, his last game he ever played? And I think the other thing you got to remember here, 1991, he had a great season. And I think, wasn't that the year they had the big comeback against the Oilers in the playoffs?
I think you said 91. I'm pretty sure it was. I think it was. Let me look real quick. I'm pretty sure that was the year.
Yeah, and then what people forget is in 1991, they went to Buffalo and played the Bills. They lost 10-7, but they got the ball back on like the 50-yard line. Elway was hurt and Gary Kubiak was the quarterback. So I think it's very possible. Super Bowl 26 could have been Denver versus Washington if John Elway was healthy in that game at the end. Because I don't think that you're going to stop John Elway from going 50 yards to win an AFC championship. You can ask the Cleveland Browns, you can give him twice that distance, and he's still going to beat you. So I've got John Elway at number 5. I think the decade of the 90s was his best decade. We talked before in the 80s, his first 3 years, he had more interceptions than touchdowns. So I've got John Elway at number 5, Sam.
And for those reasons you just mentioned, to be able to go drive down at the end of a game and win you a game like that, that's what separates him from Brett Favre, in my opinion. That's why he's higher up than Favre for my own decade.
Look at Super Bowl 32. Super Bowl 32, game's tied. Elway gets the ball with like 5 minutes left. Drives them down, they score a touchdown. Favre gets the ball back with about 2 minutes left, 60 yards to go. They go 4 and out. I think that right there tells you the difference between John Elway and Brett Favre.
And it makes it pretty clear.
Yeah, and especially when everybody considered the Packers to be the best of the 2 defenses. So that means Elway beat the better defense also.
Yeah, that's what separates him. But on to my number 5. My number 5 is Jerry Rice. And I brought him up on my top 10 list for the
Jerry Rice
well.
at number 5?
Hey, there are a lot of really good running backs up here. I've got You're giving me that look, Mike. You don't like this list very much, do you? But
Jerry Rice at number 5?
yeah, I got him number 5.
Okay.
His prime was split a little bit. He had about 4 or 5 dominant years in the 80s. That's really what
Yeah, but his
separates
prime is the 90s. Pro Bowl 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96. Come on, Sam.
I know he's got Offensive Player of the Year award, Super Bowl, 8 Pro Bowl, 6-time first-team All-Pro. But everyone else above him's got a lot of All-Pro selections as well. I've just got him at number 5. I think you can make the argument to go as high as number 2. I think number 1 for me is pretty cemented, but I think you can make him as high as number 2.
I think you can go as high as number 1 with him.
I don't know. I'm not going to give him my number 1. I think my number 1's pretty set.
Well, no, because you got him at number 5. I mean, how are you going to have Jerry Rice at number 5? He's the greatest receiver to ever play football.
He was arguably the greatest player to ever play football before I think Tom Brady kind of took over this past decade. He might have surpassed him at that point. But
Jerry Rice is a greater football player. It's harder to play wide receiver. I'm just kidding. But when I look at this, Sam, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do. Are any of these running backs ranked the best running back that's ever played the game?
Didn't think about that. Didn't think about that.
None of them named Jim Brown. So
yeah, that's true. I didn't really think about that one.
It tips off the 1960s list.
Yeah, but I will say this: the thing that pushed Rice down a little bit for me is the fact that he trailed off kind of late in the 90s. The last 3 years, it wasn't the same. And then he had, like I said, those 4 really good years in the 80s. If you had moved those years into the 90s, he would easily have been number 1. It wouldn't have been close. But I think some of the guys
don't
above
tell
him.
me you're going to have Barry Sanders at number 1, right?
No. Maybe.
Yeah, so
Probably.
you do. All right. Tell me what Barry Sanders did in the playoff games he was in. But we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah,
we'll go to number 4. My number 4 is Barry Sanders. I actually had him higher than this. I had him like 2 or 3, but I changed my mind since you're going to think so highly of him. NFL MVP in 1997. My question to you is this, Sam. I've got him at number 4. I can't list him higher because he really didn't block well. Did he catch the ball a lot out of the backfield?
He did all right. He wasn't like outstanding at that. He wasn't a superstar.
All right. So when I look at this, he was, between him and Gale Sayers, the greatest open field runner I've ever seen. I've got Barry Sanders at number 4. He did in 1991 get the Detroit Lions their first playoff win since I think the late 50s when they beat up the Dallas Cowboys, I think 34-6 in a divisional playoff game. Then they go to RFK. They got manhandled there 41-10, but that Redskin team was just a lot better than them. So I got Barry Sanders at number 4.
All right, my number 4 is, and I'm going to get torn apart for this. My number 4 is probably Bruce Smith. I have
number 4.
I know. Yeah, number 4. Did you have him higher?
Yeah, I got him higher.
All right. Well, I thought Smith, because he had 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards from that decade, 8 Pro Bowls, 6-time first-team All-Pro, 113.5 sacks. I mean, to me, you could pick him for a list for the 80s or the 90s. I think the 90s was definitely his most dominant decade. I think he improved a lot in the running game. We talked about this in the past. He got better as he got older. But to me, I think you definitely have to put him up there for the 90s. I think he's a top 5 player from that decade and arguably the best defensive end of all time.
Arguably, maybe. According to who you're arguing with, I guess, huh?
Yeah, pretty much.
So where am I at? Number 3?
I think, yeah, you're number 3.
All right. So I got 2 defensive ends and a wide receiver in my top 3. My number 3 is going to be, as you can tell, I came prepared for this. I'm actually doing my list as we go. But my number 3, I can't help it. It's just the way I am. My number 3 is Reggie White. So I think Reggie White, the impact he made with the Green Bay Packers changed the way the Green Bay Packers are perceived. People actually wanted to go to Green Bay once Reggie White went there. Reggie White was the difference. Let's face it. If Brett Favre never gets Reggie White, I don't think Brett Favre's on this top 10 list because I don't think he ever wins a Super Bowl.
No, I agree with you. I think Reggie White changed the culture and also the perception of the team in general. When he got there, it was just different. It's hard to explain in words, but I mean, you can even tell looking back on, like, I wasn't really paying attention. I wasn't around to pay attention to football back then. Well, even from what I heard, things just changed when Reggie White walked through the door.
All right, Sam, what do you got?
My number 3 is Emmitt Smith. And I understand why you had him a little bit lower. I put him up in number 3. I just like running backs. I'm a big fan of them. But I think 1993 MVP, Super Bowl MVP, 3 Super Bowls in total, 4-time first-team All-Pro, almost 17,000 yards from scrimmage in the decade and 147 total touchdowns in only 155 games for that decade. I think one of the best resumes we could have possibly from a running back during that time. He led the league in rushing 4 times. I understand why people say he should be lower on the list because he played behind one of the best offensive lines. But at the same point, I can't fault him too much for that. You only can make do with what you have, and he had one of the best offensive lines, and he completely took advantage of it.
All right, number 2, Sam.
My number 2 is Steve Young. And I understand that might be a little bit controversial, but I thought Steve Young's a guy who almost always gets overlooked when we talk about some of the best quarterbacks of all time.
If you want to know the truth, I just kind of did this list while we started the show. And if I had to do it over again, I would replace my number 10. I would put Steve Young over Brett Favre. Steve Young was a lot better quarterback than Brett Favre.
Which is why I have him all the way up to number 2 ahead of Brett Favre for sure. I think Young is
kind of stupid, but go ahead, Sam.
I think Young is definitely a top 10 quarterback of all time, possibly even top 6, maybe even top 5 if you're talking to someone who really loved him. But 2-time MVP, a Super Bowl winner, 3-time first-team All-Pro. He was an 84-31 record during the decade. He threw 200 touchdowns to only 80 interceptions. So this is a player who was dominant. He had good legs. I can only imagine what he would have been if he had been a starter earlier in his career and not had to wait basically until the age of 30 to really take over.
All right, my number 2 is Bruce Smith. I think that he is the greatest defensive end I've ever seen. 4-time AFC champion, 1980s All-Decade team, 1990s All-Decade team. There's not too many guys that do that. He was twice in the 90s, the AP Defensive Player of the Year in 1990 and 96. He was the heart of a Buffalo defense that helped take them to 4 Super Bowls. They didn't win any of them, but that's because Marv Levy was not a very good football coach. So when you look at this, the Pro Bowl selections, the All-Pro selections are what I always look at. 1990, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98. So for the entire decade, he was pretty much on the Pro Bowl team. And to me, I mean, Bruce Smith and Reggie White may be the 2 best defensive ends I've ever seen. So I've got Bruce Smith at number 2.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. He's probably one of the best defensive players you've ever seen. I'd say.
Yeah. Well, like I said, and the story I always tell is I've got to talk and hang out with Anthony Munoz a couple times. And the guy he always brings up as being the toughest dude he ever faced was Bruce Smith. And he said it wasn't even close. And Anthony Munoz faced Reggie White too. But Bruce Smith is the guy he said was the biggest handful and the hardest guy to handle.
Yeah, Anthony Munoz knows what he's talking about too. That's the best tackle ever.
Why when I rate Bruce Smith and Reggie White, I'm just going to go with what Anthony Munoz thinks because it's more important than what I think because I never played against either one of them.
Yeah.
And at 6 foot, 200 pounds, it probably wouldn't have worked out well for me anyway.
No, probably not.
All right. Well, you got it number 2, Sam.
My number 2 is, I already said my number 2 is Steve Young. So we're on to my number 1, which is Barry Sanders, and you're not very thrilled about it, but I do have Barry Sanders.
Because I just think that it's absolutely absurd to have him over my number 1, which is Jerry Rice.
No, I agree. If we're talking about like all time, I think Jerry Rice is potentially the second best player to ever live. But I feel like the decade Barry Sanders played almost entirely within the decade of the 90s. And that kind of helped him out a little bit.
Okay. Well, they were both Pro Bowl almost every year. They were both Pro Bowls or All-Pro selections damn near every year. But how about that? I mean, 2-time AP NFL Offensive Player of the Year was Barry Sanders. So we're just trying to compare them. Jerry Rice, 3 times NFC Offensive Player of the Year, 2 times NFL Offensive Player of the Year. Both on the All-Decade team. Rice was All-Decade 80s and 90s. Your guy was All-Decade in the 90s. But still, it comes down to me is this. If I have to win a huge game, do I want Barry Sanders or Jerry Rice? I'm taking Jerry Rice.
Yeah, I can understand that. I can understand that logic. You're probably right there. I might have given Barry Sanders too much credit for playing with just a very bad organization and kind of ended up having to be a solo artist a lot of time, not really having the support he needed. He did average 100 rushing yards per game in the decade, which I think is very
I think his yards per carry is like 5.0.
Yeah, he was phenomenal. And that, like, people talk about him losing yards sometimes because everyone always says that half his runs went backwards half the time, and then the other half were just like 50-yard runs where he got out there and just broke a bunch of tackles. But I think people overestimate how many runs he sometimes got tackled for losses on. He was a guy who was guaranteed to basically go out and get chunks of yards every time he touched the ball.
Well, I think the reason people bring up that yards lost was the playoff game at Lambeau Field when like 12 carries for 6 yards or something.
Oh, it was like, was it 13 for like -1 or something like that?
Yeah, it was bad. I know that.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of games, especially big games, where that happened. There was also the games, like I remember a game in Dallas on a Monday night where I think it was in 1994 against that great Cowboys team where he played out of his mind and led them to a win. Jerry Rice, to me, though, when you look at them, that 49ers team was already great when he got there. And he just kind of put them over the top and made them maybe the greatest team that we've seen. Especially you look at the Super Bowl 24 team, which I think really gets underrated. But the Super Bowl 23, in that Super Bowl, the Bengals defense pretty much throttled the 49ers running game, throttled pretty much everything. And the only thing that gave them a chance for John Taylor to catch the pass at the end was Jerry Rice. I mean, if you remember going inside the 50, Jerry Rice made a catch, broke it for like 20 or 30 yards on a huge play, which would put them in position for Taylor to catch that ball. And when you look at that defense, the Bengals had 2 or 3 guys on Jerry Rice. So John Taylor got single covered right over the middle. So Jerry Rice was a direct effect and a direct cause of that touchdown. And just when I see Jerry Rice, he was a big play guy. He'd drop a ball here and there, but I don't think we've ever seen a greater wide receiver. I think the only wide receiver that can even be in comparison with him is Don Hudson from the Green Bay Packers in the 30s and 40s, just because Don Hudson, I mean, the records he put up stood for 50 years. The game was different. Don Hudson was the first wide receiver to actually run really routes the way they are run similar today with, what was it, Hebner was the quarterback back then for Green Bay. And when you look at it, I mean, to me, those two guys stand out amongst everybody else because of the things they've done. I don't think Barry Sanders stands out as the greatest running back I've ever seen. I don't see how you can be the greatest player of an entire decade if you're pretty much a one-dimensional player. I mean, Jerry Rice go over the middle, catch the ball, turn it into an 80-yard slant for a touchdown. He could also go down the sideline, catch it 45 yards down in the air, and turn it into an 80-yard touchdown. He was also a really good blocker. And, I mean, this is a guy that was helping the Raiders go to the Super Bowl a few years after the decade of the 90s was over. And he was a top 10 in the 80s. He's a top 10 in the 90s. And he still had an effect through for at least the first few years of a third decade. And I think when you look at that and you look at the impact they have on the game, most people, unless they're really young, if you ask them who's the best wide receiver you ever saw, they're saying Jerry Rice. Most people, if you ask them who the best running back you ever saw was, don't say Barry Sanders.
Yeah, probably Jim Brown, right?
Well, I mean, I could give you Jim Brown. I could give you Walter Payton. The difference is that Jim Brown really didn't catch the ball that well. He wasn't really, I mean, he could block. I mean, to me, all-around running back, Walter Payton's the greatest I ever saw.
Oh, yeah.
Catch the ball in the backfield, run with it. He could block with it. Hell, he could throw it. So, to me, Barry Sanders is not in that conversation. And I think that he was a great running back. But also, what's the value of a great running back compared to a great wide receiver? You know, if you look at the Hall of Fame and the wide receivers that are in there with Super Bowl rings compared to the running backs, I mean, how many times did we hear the stat that, you know, maybe two running backs that ever led the NFL in rushing that same year would win the Super Bowl? And when you look at his playoff stats, outside of that win over the Dallas Cowboys, his playoff stats are not outstanding.
No, we brought up that game against Green Bay Packers where it's like 13 rushes for -1 yards. Then 95, 10 rushes, 40 yards. 97, 18 rushes, 65 yards. Those are playoff numbers, so not great. But you have to admit,
Can we
the
look at
Lions
Jerry
have a
Rice's
great.
playoff numbers now so we can compare our two number ones?
I mean, Jerry Rice is going to blow him away probably in playoff numbers, I would assume. But you have to admit, the Lions had a much worse supporting cast than what Jerry Rice had to deal with in San Francisco.
Well, the Lions weren't terrible in the 90s. I mean, they never really had the quarterback they needed, but you had, Herman Moore was still there in the early 90s, wasn't he? I mean, that 91 Detroit Lion team that went to the playoffs and came up one game short of the Super Bowl was a pretty dang good team.
Yeah, I see. I just think, obviously, Jerry Rice had a better team around him because it was a generational team. It was almost.
Yeah, but how about this? Jerry Rice had a better team around him, but you also had other receivers who were really good you could throw it to. Barry Sanders is getting these carries. This game is on Barry Sanders. The game's not necessarily on Rice, but remember this also. When it's a passing situation, Jerry Rice is getting double teamed. And he's still beating double teams. Did you read me those playoff stats yet for Jerry Rice?
Yeah, I'm going down to them right now. But you're right about the double teams, by the way. I overlooked the fact that he'd be facing 2 or 3 guys on the same play. But throughout the 90s, 122 yards in the 1990 playoffs. That was 2 games. 211 in 2 games in 92. 126 in 2 games in 93. 233 in 3 games in 94. 117 1 game in 95. 86 in 2 games in 96. And then 69 2 games in 98. So
how many touchdowns?
4, 5, 6, 8 total touchdowns in it was 8 years, 8 playoff appearances.
So that's a touchdown every year that he's in the playoffs. And those Niner teams, once you get to 95, 96, 97, it's not like they had dominant teams anymore. After 94, they kind of dropped off. They couldn't afford to keep everybody. So actually, if you look at Rice's numbers in the late 80s, I would probably consider that more of a team effort. I think what you see, there's no John Taylor there, I don't think, in 1994, right?
No, I don't think so. I think they lost some of the original players at that point.
Yeah, but he still had a much better quarterback than Barry Sanders. But Barry Sanders' offensive line with guys like Lomas Brown was not terrible.
No, he had some pieces there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why he did play in multiple playoff games in Detroit, which not many people that play in Detroit could ever say.
Almost
nobody. I think we've agreed that Jerry Rice is number 1.
All right, Mike, I'll give this one to you. I'll say Jerry Rice should be the one at number 1.
Which one have you not given to me?
I'm working on it, Mike. Okay, there'll come a time eventually where I'll win one of these arguments.
All right, you want to do the 1960s tomorrow?
Yeah, we can start with the 1960s.
We're going to go all the way back to the 1920s just for fun.
Yeah, we can do it. I'm down for it.
Just because I find no preseason games and all we get is reports out of training camp to be rather boring.
Well, and half those reports aren't even true, probably.
Well, Mackenzie Alexander for the Bengals already got arrested, so you got that.
Yeah, you got Trey Waynes who's hurt, so there goes to your offseason acquisitions.
Who got hurt?
Trey Waynes.
Trey Waynes, though, but Mackenzie Alexander is a good football player.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just soon have Damon Wayans as Trey Wayans. In Living Color. You ever watch that show, Sam?
No.
Gee, Sam. Don't you ever turn the TV on?
When there's sports on, maybe.
Well, that's sports. It's a movie. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead. We're going to wrap it up. Sam, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Sam_Teets33. I'm constantly posting new stuff there every day, so feel free to go check that out.
All right, you can find me at Grueling Truth on Twitter. You can also hear all of our podcasts on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. Wherever you find podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. Also, check out our presenting sponsor, Replenishing Care and Technologies. Check them out at rcandt.com. We will have a special show on Friday, it looks like, where James will actually do a demonstration with the PEMF machine and have some people on that have used it before to explain what it did for them. But make sure you check out the top 10 players of the 60s tomorrow. Jim Brown's number 1. That's a teaser. And Sam will probably pick Brian Piccolo.
I'll get this one right. I know. I'll figure it out.
Have you seen Brian's song?
No, I have. That sounds familiar. No, that sounds really familiar.
Really? So you're going to do an NFL show and you've never seen Brian's song and you don't know what it is?
Definitely heard that name before. What is that?
I
That's
see you looking it
movie.
up. It's about Brian Piccolo, who became best friends with Gale Sayers, and then Sayers gets hurt. Piccolo helps him recover from all the knee injuries, and then Piccolo gets sick and ends up dying. It's a very sad movie. It'll make you cry unless you're Inhuman.
I have not seen it, but I'll add to the long list of stuff you're telling me to watch.
Well, just watch Brian's song tonight before we come on the show tomorrow.
All right, I'll see if I can find a way to watch it.
I'm sure you can. Everything's streamed anymore. All right, guys. Remember, Replenishing Carrot Technologies. Me and Sam will be back at 1 o'clock Eastern Time tomorrow to talk top 10 players of the 60s. So for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.